Thank you for having us. My name's Liz Krellin. I work as a data manager in the Improvement Analytics Unit, which is a partnership between NHS England and the Health Foundation. And at the Improvement Analytics Unit, we evaluate complex initiatives in healthcare in order to support learning and improvement. So I'm here today to talk about work that we've been doing in the IAU, looking at the association between household context and emergency hospital use. And in fact, Richard, who is also on this call, his name is on this slide, so he may be helping out with some of the questions that come up as well. We know from studies from population health that household context factors, such as social isolation or caring responsibilities, may have a big impact on health outcomes. And these kind of factors are already used when health professionals make clinical decisions. So, for example, identifying patients to refer to multidisciplinary teams. But metrics for household context factors are not routinely collected in administrative data in England, so are therefore not accounted for in analyses of healthcare resource use. So for policymakers, there isn't clear evidence on whether household context factors influence the effectiveness of different care interventions. So what we've done is develop two household context factors, and they are living alone and living in a two-person household with a person who is frail. And we used pseudonymized address information from a central database of GP registration. We'll talk about the data source in a bit more detail later on. And we linked this to hospital records to look at the association between the two household context factors and emergency hospital use in older people. And we analysed just under 5 million people aged over 65 and living in households of up to 6 people. So one of our working premises is that household context can be a proxy for additional care needs. Approximately a third of people aged over 65 in England live alone, which obviously doesn't necessarily mean they're socially isolated. They may have networks of friends and family, but for older people living alone is a risk factor for social isolation due to factors such as loss of physical or mental ability and death of close family or friends. And living alone may have an adverse effect on things like medication compliance and healthy eating. And living with someone with frailty can imply informal caring responsibilities, which might mean the carer neglects their own well-being or might be at risk of social isolation. And in the UK in 2019, it was estimated that over 2 million people aged over 65 were carers. So a previous analysis by the Health Foundation, based on one large GP practice, found that living alone was associated with emergency health hospital use. So using the master patient index dataset, which we'll discuss a bit more on the next slide, we were able to look at our two household context indicators on a national level. So using that national data, we sought to find out the prevalence of these indicators amongst the English population aged over 65, and the characteristics of people living alone or with someone with a frailty. And we also looked at whether these household context factors are predictive of A&E attendance and emergency admissions. So the data sources. As I said, the Improvement Analytics Unit is a partnership between NHS England and the Health Foundation. So we benefit from a data processing contract with NHS England. So effectively, the IAU can process data on NHS England's behalf in order to fulfil their legal obligations. So that's including reviewing and improving quality of care, researching what treatments work best, and helping make decisions about which services to commission. So this means we have access to pseudonymized versions of different national data sets, depending on the sponsored task. So here we used a minimized version of the Master Patient Index, or MMPI, which is a health data set based on GP registration data in England. The MPI is maintained and developed by colleagues in data management and integration services, formerly data services at NHS England. And it was formerly based on data from NHS, or the National Health Application and Infrastructure Services, but it's now based on Personal Demographics Service, or PDS data. Then the version we have used for this analysis was the NHS version. So it is a patient-level data set. And the version we had access to contained a pseudonymized NHS number linkable to hospital records. There are dates detailing the dates that the records are valid from and until. There's a pseudonymized version of the unique property reference number, or UPRN, for where the person lives. So every property in England has a UPRN, and it was this variable that allowed us to see how many people were living at an address at a given time, so that we could see who, if people were living alone. And the MPI also has a flag indicating if someone is living in a care home. It also included approximate date of birth and date of death, if applicable, and the GP practice and LSOA code. So getting into our methods, we looked at a study population that consisted of all people aged 65 years or older and registered at a GP practice in England on 16th of December 2018. We limited the study population to those living alone or in a household of 6 people or fewer. So this meant we were excluding people living in care homes or other establishments. And we also limited our population to people who had a hospital admission record in the previous 3 years. And this was so that we could be sure of having an accurate record of their previous diagnoses. And we looked at outcomes for these people for 1 year, unless individuals were censored due to death, a move into a care home, or a larger household. We defined those household context indicators as we've outlined here. So for those living alone, there was no other person with the same UPRN in the study period. And for the analysis of living with someone with frailty, we restricted to 2-person households where the person aged 65 or over was living with someone with any of the conditions or events in Soon et al.'s list of syndromes coded in inpatient records in the previous 3 years. So using the MPI, we were able to work out at monthly intervals whether people lived alone or with other people using the pseudonymized UPRN. And we looked at those monthly intervals 1 year before the index date of 16th of December 2018 and 1 year after the index date. We could see whether a person was resident of a care home, and we were able to link the MPI records to hospital records. So that was secondary use services, or SAS hospital data, via the pseudonymized NHS number. And this allowed us to find out the previous diagnoses for the cohabitees that people lived with. So we could see if someone lived with another person who had a previous diagnosis of a frailty-related condition. And we could also get historical and follow-up counts of their hospital use. And then we also linked to publicly available reference data based on the LSOA of the GP practice where they were registered. So that was data on deprivation and rurality. So we described the characteristics of people living alone and people living in a 2-person household with someone with a frailty condition. And we investigated the effect of these indicators on emergency hospital use by carrying out multivariable regression, adjusting for a range of factors that are predictive of emergency hospital use. So this included age, gender, ethnicity, geographic region, deprivation, rural or urban classification of the location, historic emergency hospital use in the last 12 months, and a range of long-term conditions recorded in the previous 3 years, including frailty indicators and history of mental or serious mental ill health, but a range of others as well. And the analysis of living alone was carried out using the entire study population. But when we looked at the effect of living with someone with frailty, we limited the analysis data set to people living in households of 2 people. We also censored individuals' follow-up when their status in terms of the household context flags changed during the follow-up period. And we included as many covariates as possible without over-parametrizing the model in order to remove any known confounding. And we used a negative binomial model as the data were over-dispersed, and rate ratios were produced to interpret the results. So here's the start of our baseline characteristics table. So we looked at the baseline characteristics for people who were living alone or not living alone, and people living in 2-person households with someone with frailty, or in 2-person households where the cohabitee was not recorded as frail. We compared the proportions that we found with nationally available data and found they were broadly comparable for the population aged 65 and older, although the age distribution in our data was older on average than the national population. So we attributed that to our data being limited to patients who had attended hospital in the previous 3 years. So people living alone or in 2-person households made up over 80% of the population. We found that people living alone were more often female, older, and living in more deprived and urban areas. People in 2-person households were generally more often living in the least deprived areas, but a greater proportion of people living with someone with frailty lived in the most deprived areas compared to people living with someone not recorded as frail. And then looking at diagnosis history and hospital usage, people aged 65 or over and living alone were more often frail, so 33% versus 21%, and had on average more long-term conditions, 2.3 versus 2, compared with the people in 2 to 6-person households not living alone. And there were greater numbers of A&E attendance or emergency admissions in the previous 12 months for those living alone than those not living alone. Within the 2-person household groups, people living with someone with frailty were more often frail and had on average more long-term conditions than those living with one other person not recorded as being frail. And in the previous 12 months, those living with someone with a frailty had higher numbers of A&E attendance and emergency admissions than those living with someone not recorded as having a frailty. So we looked at the Crude rates of emergency hospital use in the follow-up period. Just getting into the results. And people aged 65 or older living alone had on average 0.78 A&E attendances per person per year in the follow-up period. And compared to that, there were 0.56 A&E attendances for people living in households of 2 to 6 people. They had on average 0.51 emergency admissions per person per year compared to 0.33 for people living in households of 2 to 6 people. Then people aged 65 or over living with someone with a frailty had on average 0.69 A&E attendances per person per year in the follow-up period, compared with 0.53 for people living in households of 2 people where the cohabitee was not recorded as frail. And those living with someone frail had on average 0.44 emergency admissions per person per year, compared with 0.32 for those not living with someone recorded as frail. So here are the unadjusted rate ratios for rates of emergency admissions and A&E attendances over the follow-up year for each household context indicator. So here the dotted line indicates no effect. This is a forest plot. It's quite difficult to see the 95% confidence intervals. They don't come up at all for the living alone. And that's because of the large size of the data set. So going in order from top to bottom, we found that in people living alone, the rate of emergency admissions was 54% higher. The rate of A&E attendances was 40% higher than those not living alone. And in people living with someone with frailty in a two-person household, the rate of emergency admissions was 38% higher, and the rate of A&E attendance was 31% higher than in other people in two-person households. And then looking at adjusted rate ratios, so our regression analysis adjusted for variables predictive of emergency hospital use, as I said before. And just to note, this scale is slightly different to the one I've just shown you, so they're not directly comparable. But once we adjusted for predictors, in people living alone, the rate of emergency admissions was then 14% higher, and the rate of A&E attendances was 10% higher than in people not living alone. And in people living with someone with frailty, the two-person household, in a two-person household, the rate of emergency admissions was 9.8% higher, and the rate of A&E attendances was 10% higher than in other people living in a two-person household. So the key findings for us, first, people aged 65 and over and living alone were more often frail and had on average more long-term conditions compared with people in 2 to 6 person households. And people aged 65 and older and living with a person in frailty were more often frail and had more long-term conditions than people living in other two-person households. When we adjusted for a range of baseline characteristics predictive of emergency hospital use, people living alone attended A&E 9% more often and were admitted to hospital in an emergency 14% more often than those living with others. And individuals living with someone with frailty attended A&E 9% more often and were admitted to hospital as an emergency 10% more often than others in a two-person household. So how do we interpret all this? Well, first, we have demonstrated how household context metrics can be derived from administrative data. We've also seen there is a strong association between both living alone and living with someone with frailty and emergency hospital use in people over the age of 65, even after we adjust for predictive factors. We believe that these two household context factors are important in understanding patients' health and care needs, and that they should be considered when planning for their care. Whilst these type of metrics can't replace a personal assessment of how an individual's household context of an individual's household context and support needs, this analysis shows a kind of proof of concept that nationally collected and pseudonymized address data can provide useful information about a person's health and care needs. And potentially, if developed centrally and made available to analysts and others, these metrics could be used for planning, commissioning, and population health management, as well as for improving analyses. So some next steps. As I said, it would be possible to develop these household context factors centrally and make them more widely available. And there is a commitment to make products like the MPI available more widely, subject to appropriate ID arrangements. How a version of the MPI for use by another NHS organisation can be made available would depend on whether the organisation wants to or can look at patient identifiable or anonymous data. So it will depend on the legal basis for accessing the data. We are thinking that you could develop other household context factors using the same data, such as whether someone has recently been bereaved. And we're also going to compare reasons for admission to hospital for people living alone versus those living in multi-person households to see if this might explain some of the differences in hospital usage. And finally, in the IAU, we're currently finalising a re-evaluation of the effect of multidisciplinary care teams on emergency hospital use. So the referral was based on clinical judgment. So we're reevaluating to see if including household context factors change the results. In other words, to try and improve on the capture of unobserved confounding. However, the results actually appear to be unaffected, and we think this is because the comparison group, even when not matched specifically on household context factors, was similar on these factors, more similar than in the original analysis that I've just been talking about. And if patients were referred to MDTs due to social isolation, then the association between our household context factors and social isolation will be different in the MDT group than in the population at large. So therefore also in the comparison group. So it may be that these household context factors are not as useful as we had hoped for limiting unobserved confounding in cases where social isolation might have been one of the referral criteria. But we think the household context factors may still be useful additional covariates in other types of analyses. So finally, this is the paper that we've published, and so that it includes a lot more detail about the analysis. And that's it. We'd be glad to take any questions. So just a little bit again about the Improvement Analytics Unit and the Health Foundation. We're a partnership between the Health Foundation and NHS England and Improvement. And there are lots of ways of staying in touch with us at the Health Foundation. These are our email addresses for questions if you have any afterwards, but we're happy to take some.
Thanks very much, Liz. I'm doing that thing again where I've changed headsets and I'm the microphone is on the other side. Okay, thank you very much for that. I think it's a really interesting study, piece of research and use of that linked data in a different way, and it would be really useful to audience here and other analysts if the IG were in place for that data to be used by others as well. So I've got a couple of there's a couple of questions which have been posted on Menti. I'll share my screen, and one or two might have been answered as you move through the presentation, but I'll share them anyway. And if you can't answer them, then I'm sure Richard can. So I'll just share my screen. There we go.
Hello, I'm sorry I lost internet there.
Liz, is that you talking? You lost the internet?
Yes.
Are you back? Are you back? Are you back
yes.
in the room?
I don't know if you managed to get the end of the presentation.
Your timing, your timing must have been perfect because you finished the presentation. There was a the perfect pause, and then I started talking about my headset going wrong. But yeah, so I have shared my screen, I think. And so you should be able to see on the screen. There's just one or two points and a couple of questions. Can you see the screen? And all I was saying was when you weren't in the room was you may have picked off a couple of these as you moved through the presentation. So I don't know if you want to select one of these points, or I can pick one for you.
I can take a couple of them.
Sure.
So the limit of up to 6 people per household. We don't know. I mean, what we were using the UPRNs, and other than having a care home flag to identify definite care homes, as far as we're aware, using sort of the algorithms and the address matching that they use at the data services within NHS England. We didn't really know. We chose 6 as being probably that it wouldn't be, but it could have included more than that. I mean, it's part of the sort of the one of the problems with the study, where there may be in the future that we might have access, or people might have access to a lot more descriptives of what type of property that somebody is living at in the future, but in this instance we didn't. we took the view that 6 was about the right number, because there are, I think, from other statistics, there are sort of around about 2% of people living in 7-person households. And so we felt 7 was probably getting too high, so just pick a cut-off point, really. And also in terms of whether people had regular carers, independent of, we had no way of knowing that, I'm afraid. You know, it was just literally these people in the data set share the same UPRN, or there is nobody else sharing the UPRN at that month in time, and so we had no way of linking to any other sort of carer information at all.
Yeah, I was just thinking from my own experience. So my father, he lives by himself, and so he would, from the information that you would have about him, you wouldn't know about the all his family going in and doing this and doing that. So you just wouldn't know. And I imagine that's quite common as well. But you just, unless you have that data, I'm not on a database. I don't think, as a carer. I'd be very surprised. In fact, deeply shocked if I was. Excuse me. But yes, no, I appreciate that. But I think you've covered that in, I think, in maybe some of the limitations, the description of the research.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely couldn't say because you're living alone you are socially isolated or you have care needs. We're just kind of just saying that this is a risk factor for that social isolation and care needs. It's the most we can say, really.
Okay, so there's obviously there's a point here about the presentation being very interesting, and I totally agree with that. There is another comment here about the use of this evidence or this research in population health management, which this is obviously probably one of its potential main uses. I'd have thought it's all about how can you use this type of evidence, this type of information in planning. And if in fact it's derived from data that can be used by others with the right conditions in place, then it could be develop local systems to improve identification and responses to that with service provision locally. There's a question here that just popped up which says, is it possible to see what happens in multi-generation households?
Again, I can answer. I mean, within the MPI, what we also get is an approximate date of birth, and so it's month and year of birth, and so obviously we can calculate an approximate age from that, and so you could potentially look to define whether something is intergenerational. The only problem with that is, what are your assumptions behind that? How do you say, okay, any age difference of 18 years, 20 years is definitely intergenerational in that case, but then some people who are older than others live with their partners who are much younger and that kind of thing. So you could never be 100% sure. And so there's going to be a lot of assumptions in that part.
Okay, so I think this question was covered after it was posed, which was how was the effect of confounders mitigated in the modelling? So what techniques did you use to do that?
Yeah, we tried to make sure that we adjusted for all the predictors that were available but obviously there will be unobserved confounding that we can't account for in there. So the predictors that we did include were age, ethnicity, gender, a range of comorbidities that are predictive of hospital use and previous hospital use for the last 12 months, and probably a couple of other things as well.
Okay. Okay, so there's another question here about which says, is the pseudo UPRN contained NCDR sus tables, or only in the MMPI. I was doing so well. And apologies for people who don't like acronyms, but for those who do, this question is just like right up your street. So if you could just if you could just respond to that one.
Yeah, so the unique property reference numbers, or the pseudonymized versions of them, are in the master patient index, and we got the minimized master patient index, which is right, so the MMPI as well. They're not in the secondary usage services data, as far as I'm aware at the moment. Of whether there are any, I don't think there are any plans to actually put them in there at the moment, because obviously that would involve a lot of calculating at the time that you go into hospital. Where were you living, which UPRN to put in at that point? I suppose it's feasible, but I don't think they will be putting them into the sus data themselves. The master patient index is based on the GP registration records rather than the hospital records themselves. Just on those UPRNs, I think there is a move to try and include them more at the point of data collection. So I think there's some moves to get them into, if they haven't already happened, into some of the GP systems like EMIS. System 1, so that they can actually record the UPRN from a drop down when somebody first registers or when something changes, rather than going through at the moment. What it does is go through a sort of an address matching algorithm so that it can come up with what is thought to be the appropriate UPRN, and hopefully they will get used more regularly in other data sets, as well as being a more accurate representation of where somebody lives, rather than relying on how somebody describes their address or writes down their address.
Okay, it sounds like it would be useful to put it in that source, but that over time, over a lot of time, that may happen. There's a question here that somebody who may have missed this as part of the presentation, but you can see it here. So they have observed that proximity to hospital and accessibility or quality of primary care have been associated with, and in particular, A&E utilisation. So in terms of confounders or explanations, interpretations, were any of these variables included in the research?
That's a really interesting point. No, I suppose theoretically there is a sort of possibility there to look at location and how that might impact accessibility of care, but it's not something we looked into or included.
No, it is interesting, isn't it? Because I think living in Staffordshire and having done a lot of work, sort of analysis around sort of accessibility, because there's such a high proportion of Staffordshire is rural, and in fact sort of many of the counties around here, it's something that we'd always sort of consider. And it's if somebody lives closer to a service or a provision, they're probably more likely to go to it, and equally if their primary care alternatives aren't there. So there's a lot of factors that could be taken into consideration, and extremely difficult to map out and reflect in a piece of research like this. But all the same, if you are using this for population health management and service planning, you'd be considering some of these factors anyway, I'd thought. I was interested. I haven't read the research in detail, and hopefully I was listening, but I may have missed it. But and I know you've noticed it as as one of the limitations is the people who you have in this study were had previously been in hospital. So obviously that will necessarily have reflected their the age composition, and you won't be able to generalize as if you would have if it was people who hadn't been in hospital or included anybody. But I think that's it's still really, really very useful, as people are saying here. Very, very interesting, and a very useful piece of work. And I do hope that you are able to follow this up with more work, because it feels like there's much more that can be done in this area. You must be having these thoughts, unless you've moved on to lots of other things, Liz.
Yeah, well, you might want to say, Richard, about.
Yeah, well, first of all,
what we might plan.
Yeah, I mean, would be if there's any sort of research, particularly around that sort of proximity to hospitals and the sort of the quality of the services, we're very interested in having a look at that, and particularly if anybody's then tried to put that into any predictive models as a sort of a compounding factor, that would be great. I think that's really interesting. Yeah, we are looking, as Liz said in the presentation, we are looking at the reasons for admission, between comparing the two different sets of groups, particularly those living alone. I mean, we haven't completed all of the that sort of follow-up stuff at the moment, but it is have had a quick look at some of the data. Then it is going in because of a fall seems to be high on the list, and as does sort of UTIs, which is kind of we have an in-house GP who works at the Health Foundation as well, and before we looked at the data, there were a couple of things that she suspected might be reasons why. So it was interesting that appears to be so. We need to look more closely to see if there's any significant differences between people living alone and those who are not. I think there's a huge amount of possibilities of what you can do with the UPRNs and what we might be able to look at in the future as well. They're certainly looking at how they might develop that further within NHS England as well, just to see some of those possibilities. The fire service, I know, are keen, have been starting to use it, I believe, because that identification of single households, because single people are known to be more likely to be more at risk of fire starting or not noticing that a fire has started as well. So getting some of their promotional messages out to them as well is what they're looking at doing.
Okay. Yeah, I've heard that as well. Okay, well, I think that will, unless we have any more questions, and I'll just double check, which we don't, that will conclude your session with us, but don't go, because I'm just going to, I have a hand up actually. Stephen, your question.
Thanks, Rachel, and thanks, Liz and Richard, for your presentation. It's a great piece of work. We've been through a process recently of trying to work out what some of the important questions that we'd like to try and address for local ICBs might be, and got a call for a call out for people to volunteer or propose questions that we might look into. And actually, one of them relates quite closely to the work you've done, and it did get a lot of support. It wasn't chosen as one of the selected projects, but that was about, generally, the way it was framed was about trying to find ways of capturing variables about the wider determinants of health into our research. And essentially that's what you've done with these two variables, isn't it? These are two variables we know of for a long time we've suspected are important drivers of hospital use, and you've managed to incorporate them into the data sets and show the relationship. So incredibly useful. And I mean, it's useful research in its own right, but it's useful more for me because it makes the point that we should have access to these sorts of variables so that we can incorporate into our own analysis. So thanks for pushing on that and making that easy for other people in the future. I had a very particular question, and I haven't quite formed it in my head yet, so it's going to come out a bit garbled. But if it doesn't come out right, I might try out an email to you later and test it out. But it's about the prior hospital use variables. So when you were incorporating those into your models, did you also have information about whether or not the variables of interest, living alone or living with somebody with frailty, were present at the time of when those prior hospital uses took place? For me, that feels important, but I can't quite put my finger on why it is. But I think it's because there might be a causal relationship between the outcome, one of your covariates, and your outcome of interest.
It is one of the things I think that we mentioned in the paper as being a possible limitation, is that because you is not knowing quite how long somebody has been living alone. We did look back a full year to see that if they had been living alone, but we didn't go further back than that, although we did then for the prior hospital use. And so I think you're right, there is something in there that, you know, may also be having effect or not having an effect. If they've been living alone for a long while, for instance, then that might they might be very settled, be very used to it, very and so that could be in the mix as well. One of the other things that we've thought we might look at some stage as well is how much people have maybe moved around, and so is their housing unstable rather than, you know, living, so changing places over time quite quickly, and also whether somebody has recently had a bereavement and whether that's an, you know, something that then has a detrimental effect on their health as well. But you are right. You know, there's probably some more work to do in terms of looking at what that household whether somebody's been living alone for quite a long time or not.
Well, my instinct is that you might end up actually understating the impact of loneliness if it's incorporated into your prior hospital use variables somehow. That might be controlling out some of the loneliness or loneliness, living alone effects somehow. The effect might even be larger than you were estimating.
We did actually do a sensitivity analysis omitting the prior emergency hospital use from the model, and basically, well, quite a similar result. It wasn't really stronger, but
that's reassuring. Thank you. But thanks again for the great piece of work. Really enjoyed hearing about it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thanks Liz and Richard. And I'm now going to just take the opportunity in the last couple of minutes of session today, and I'm going to be telling you about what's going to happen in the next couple of huddles, and the next huddle, which is in a couple of weeks. There's something strange happening. Oh, sorry. Alexa, stop. She's talking back to me. She thinks she knows everything. This she'll be telling you my shopping list in a minute, and I do not joke about that because she's done it before. I must move her or change her name. Yeah, so in our next huddle, where I won't be because I may have mentioned I am going to be on holiday, but Gareth Wrench is going to be hosting the huddle next time. So in safe hands there. So we have an information portal from NOTS, which is going to be talking about the newly developed dashboards and intelligence reports to support PHM, and that is a system which is located for the use of everybody in that system, or many people in that system. We're also going to be talking about a bit more about reproducible analytical pipelines and many more things which I am not including on here, but I also including a nice picture of a meadow. So, but I do want to just mention very briefly that we do have a prospectus. The new prospectus is out for the training and development program for 22-23, so obviously we're well into that at the moment, and a lot of these programs are rolling and ongoing, but it's been refreshed now because we have got 1 or 2 courses which are brand new. But I did want to just highlight the system dynamics training program that Stacey Croft and Douglas talked about last time. So that is something that I emailed everybody on a couple of days ago, maybe yesterday. Deadlines are quite short for this one. I wondered if it might be worth. If I click on this, do you see this screen, or do you see do you see the web page, or do you still see the Menti screen? Does anybody want to tell me what you see? Liz, do you still see? Oh, you still see the web page? Great. Perfect. So so just very briefly, guys. So this was about the system dynamics modeling training. And if you go to this web page and you can click on the screen, you can see a bit more information about it, including the a flyer which gives you all the details that you need to know. And this training allows you to have 22 half days of training with Douglas McKelvey. There's quite intensive support, and in addition to that, we'd expect you to be having about 20 to 30 days on the project that you have selected. So it's quite intensive, but it's an excellent opportunity. Can't sort of stress that enough. But the lead time is quite short because it starts in September. So get in there, connect with your intelligence function leads if you can, and sort of if you're interested, just let them know that you're interested, and they will take it from there. So it's really important that you get that level of interest, that interest in now, because the lead time is quite short for that one, and it's quite a lot of time to spend on that training. But the benefits, you will reap the benefits for both yourself and your team and your organisation. We've also got leadership development for analyst program, which is first iteration of this for this year is happening in November. So that's open. We've already got plenty of people on that, but please don't miss that opportunity, unless, of course, you want to take advantage of the leadership development for analyst course, which is going to be residential, and that's going to be in February. So if you want to hold off for that, then do that. The registration for that will be available soon. Just check out the prospectus and check out the training and development webpage, because all of this information is on there, and we've got new dates for intro to Markdown, intro to GitHub, and many more. So please do make the most of those opportunities, and I will come right back to you, and I will finish session by saying thanks again to Richard and Liz. Really great to hear your work. You're welcome back anytime, and I do hope you do come back. If I spot any unanswered questions, I'll pass them on, and I think Stephen's going to be emailing you anyway, Richard, to pursue some of that. So thanks again, and I'll say goodbye to everybody, and I'll see you all in 4 weeks from now, but don't mean that. So you come back in 2 weeks and I'll see you all in 4 weeks. Is that absolutely clear? Okay. Thanks, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Thanks for listening.
Thank you.